Hello and welcome to another video. I took the day off from doing this yesterday. Primarily, as I've said before, sort of running out a little bit on things to talk about. So I might have to broaden the subject matter a little bit, which is not what I want to do. I want to kind of save that for the Sunday stroll, but needs must. We'll figure it out. But anyway, the subject today is going to be about video game journalism. What has happened to it? There's no doubt in my mind in the last few years we've seen a decline in video game journalism. I'm not even necessarily talking about quality but quantity. If you think about how many video game websites there were 10 years ago and I compare that to how many there are today, they're far fewer in number. Far fewer. There? So, yeah. Far fewer in number than there were before. And this, I think, is a multifaceted thing. Some of these, certainly in the earlier days, a lot of these sites were tied in and linked to physical media, physical publications. And when they started to go away and the physical media started to go, their online presence started to fade as well a little bit. In some cases, not all. It's important to stress that. So, yeah. But we'll get into that when we get to the park. And if I don't fall down a hole like I nearly did then. We'll get into that. But I think it is a shame. You know, as a kid growing up, I always wanted to work either for a video game company or be a video game reviewer. My dream job back in the 80s would have been to work for Zap64, who covered Commodore 64 and later on Commodore Amiga games. I'd have loved to have had that job, but it wasn't to be. So, yeah. In any event, we're getting to that point where it's like, time to go to the park. Well, point my camera at it, but it would be looking at somebody's house, maybe through the window. I've just seen a crow take a roof tile off. Interesting. Anyway, see you in the park. So yeah, here we are in the park. We'll now get into the meat and drink of it. They've actually marked out the football field. Playing football probably at the weekends. That'd be interesting. Hopefully when I come for my walk on a Sunday it'll be before that starts, otherwise I will have to find somewhere else because it'll be too noisy. But anyway, Yeah, so that was the job I really wanted, and I guess that would have encapsulated just gaming journalism as a whole. But that is what I really wanted to do back in the day, and obviously things didn't pan out quite the way that I hoped or anticipated. A lot of it was just down to how life pans out, but it was a conversation that I had with a friend of the family who was really into computers, and he liked playing games, but he was working doing insurance, and the conversation was like, you're really good at this. Like, he set up my Commodore 64 had a graphics interface program called GEOS, and he set that up for me on my Commodore 64. It was like Windows before Windows, really. And yeah, he set that up on my computer for me. And I remember asking him, why don't you do this for a living? You know, why aren't you making a living out of this? You're really good at it. And he says, well, it's my hobby. It's what I enjoy doing. You know, why would I? If I did this as a job, what would I do as a hobby? Well, I thought it was a pretty fair answer, and it set me back thinking, well, if I was doing game reviewing or game journalism as a job, what would my main interest become then outside of that? Because you're not thinking along certain lines as a kid. Work and play are two very distinct, different things. That's born out of school life and home life. So you keep those two things very separate, and because you don't have life experience, you do that with your hobbies as well. So I kept them both separate, and the idea therefore of becoming a games journalist suddenly didn't appeal to me anymore. And it was probably a mistake, really, because the saying, if you do something you love for a living, you don't ever work a day in your life. That was something that had never been taught me or anything that I'd considered, So why would I? Why would I think that, well, I'll be doing something I love for a living and that would be great? It's weird what advice you can pick up on at certain ages can define your way of thinking for a period of time. I'm doing this now and it's not a job, but I'm talking about games, and I'm not doing it for a living because I don't make any money doing this. But it hasn't impacted my love of gaming in any way. It's made it, it's probably about the same, really. It's neither worse. I wouldn't say it was better or more intense now. It is what it is. And yeah, it'll continue that way. I think till till the end, really. So but yeah, I kind of dropped the idea. And then, just started to go down the conventional means of a kid in the 80s. You get your education and then you get some kind of boring ass job at the end of it, which is pretty much what happened until illness came along and wrecked even that. But anyway, back on to what I was saying. Journalism in gaming. I think it took a bit of a nosedive, didn't it? In and around the sort of Gamergate era. It was that whole thing with people showing their ass because they thought there was collusion between games. I think the decline in journalism, gaming journalism, really sort of kicked off in the era of YouTube. People can point to the whole Gamergate thing. I don't necessarily think that was the end of game journalism as such. I don't think it helped. I think it created a bit of a schism, and I think that people, generally speaking, were unhappy with the state of games journalism at the time. I honestly don't blame them. I think that there was definitely a case of people being just generally unhappy with the direction that things were going. And not just in game journalism, but I think in gaming as a whole. In game journalism, it kind of paid a bit of a price, didn't it? They got caught up in the crossfire of general malcontent. And Gamergate is a very thorny issue still to this day. I mean, they tried to bring it back, was it last year? With Gamergate 2. But I don't think that was the main culprit. I think it played a part. But when you've seen the sheer volume of video game websites that have disappeared in the last sort of 10 years, there has to be something else. People aren't getting angry enough about that to stop going to websites. There's not enough people. I can tell you that right now. That was something that only people into video games in a hardcore way were upset about that. Your average gamer, they didn't care about that. They didn't care about journalistic integrity because most of them aren't even going to them websites in the first place. Most people in games, they buy 2 or 3 games a year and it's always the same game. So it's either FIFA or Madden, Call of Duty, that kind of thing. They're not looking at what the scores are for them things. They already know what they're getting before they come out. And they buy them regardless. So, I don't necessarily hold with that. I don't necessarily hold with that at all. I think the thing that really put their nail in the coffin for a lot of these places was YouTube and the rise of that. I think a lot of people saw YouTube as a platform with which to get the opinion of what they would perceive to be real gamers. Now, I think what would be fair to say, and would be right to say, is that what Gamergate really did shine a light on, and this is important, this is where I think it did have an impact, not a killing blow, but definitely landed a blow, was, can you really trust what these journalists were putting up there? And that was from the perspective of people that did go to these websites to get content, get an opinion on stuff, you know, get an opinion on games, get an opinion on the latest news, reviews. You know, the people like me when I was a kid, you know, and I'd go out and I'd buy Zap 64 and I'd buy CMVG. They would be the stuff that I would use back then to judge whether I wanted to get a particular game or not. Because there was no internet, there were no videos, everything was done via static screens, a static screenshot. So, you know, what did I have to use was that. And you bought your magazine once a month, you read the reviews, you know, and that was it. You went off with it. You made your decision based upon that. That was how you did it. And people were using these websites to do the same thing, which is fair enough, you know. They were doing that. They were making their decisions for games. Just put that twig out of the way, or somebody breaks their neck on it. And you look at that and you go, yeah, okay, fair enough. But the problem that you have going forward from that is that you then have the situation of how much can you rely on those reviews and the news and the opinion. What worth is it? What worth does that all end up having if you can't trust it? So where does the lack of trust come from? Well, like I say, that is partially where I think Gamergate did play a role, with the lack of trust. You know, people, you know, becoming clued into the fact that these reviews might not be necessarily unbiased. That they might actually be a more sinister reason for games getting the scores that they get. You know. So, you know, you look at certain review scandals down the years in the industry. The Driver 3 one springs immediately to mind. That was atrocious, what happened with that, where a couple of magazines, an Xbox One and a PlayStation One, were given early access to the game. They reviewed it, gave it really high scores, And then when the game come out and people bought it, it was bug ridden. It was crap. It was massively broken. And this wasn't covered in the reviews. And when other publications that hadn't been given early access, when they did their review, it transpires that the actual scores were a lot lower. You know, it was getting, instead of 9 out of 10, it was getting 3 out of 10, which in my view was a lot more reflective of the actual game itself and the quality of the game itself. It was atrocious. There were game-breaking bugs everywhere in it. And it was a shame because there was the nucleus of a great game in there. But, yeah, it wasn't to be. So, you ended up with a really poor time for the reviewers. You know, they got a lot of stick for it when that come out, and justifiably so. And this is way before Gamergate, way before it, you know. This is it was way before Gamergate occurred, and you know, consequently, I would say that this problem was an old one. What Gamergate did was, because of the internet, it shone a big light on it all. And that was what made people sit up and take notice. But it wasn't the killing blow. The killing blow was YouTube. And then what really finished it off was live streaming, you know, over on Twitch. People could see the game being played by a gamer, by just a regular, average, everyday person, not a journalist. And if you wanted to gauge what the game was going to be like from your perspective, that was going to be it. So, you know, eventually people just cottoned on to that. Thought, oh, you know, what the hell am I doing wasting time going on these websites where there is a question of the integrity of what I'm reading. I might as well watch some YouTube videos of some real gamers. Now, the reason why it wasn't an instant thing when YouTube arrived was because it took a while for YouTube to catch up in terms of its quality and the technology to be able to capture videos. In the early days, like back in 2010, my early videos comprised of me pointing a camera at the screen, you know, and then I did get a video capture card, but it was standard definition, you know, it wasn't the best. But these days now, with the likes of OBS and modern capture cards that will capture at 4K at 60 frames per second, that's no longer a thing. You know, That is no longer a thing. You can capture really good quality images at high resolution and upload them to YouTube. And that was, I think, once that started and YouTube dropped its limit on videos only being 10 minutes long, you know, which these websites with their videos, they didn't have that because they used proprietary players for their website, so they could stick videos up for as long as necessary. But once that went away, it gave every gamer the tools needed, and especially now with consoles, especially like the PS5, you just press a button and it'll capture the gameplay and upload it to YouTube for you. You can do a voiceover. You can even add effects and text. So there's literally nothing that you can't do, even out of the box with something like a PS5. The Xbox Series X is a little bit more limited with how long that'll record for some weird reason, I don't know why. But you can also stream directly from these consoles. You don't need complex hardware to connect it to. You don't need to spend vast sums of money on capture devices and so on. You're good to go out of the box. So the requirement for broadcasting, doing these things live, it's diminished quite a lot, and in turn that has meant that the need to actually go to websites or specific video game sites or whatever, there's no requirement for that anymore. You just go off. Anyone can do it. I do it. And then that's it. That's what I'm saying. Like people dial into that. People responded to that. And that's what you ended up. I think that was the real nail in the coffin. But I didn't. I'm not disputing the fact that people weren't annoyed and fed up. They responded accordingly. Given the option, that's when they moved over. But it was a shame, really, because growing up, I had 2 publications that I got every month. Computer and video games. That was my Bible. That covered all computers and stuff like that. It was brilliant magazine. And then for just Commodore 64, I got Zap 64, which later covered the Amiga when I got the Amiga. And both of those publications I kind of relied on. I mean, Zap, here again, here's another example. Zap 64 was owned obviously by a publishing house, magazine publishing house, who also owned a software publisher called Thalamus. Now, it was fair to say that some of Thalamus's games got more generous treatment, shall we say, by Zap. Zap had 2 main awards. Gold medal was the highest, and then a Sizzler, which was the one that came underneath that. And there were a number of Thalamus games that you would say, Sizzler at best, and they get a gold medal. The fortunate thing was, and perhaps why it didn't really kick up that much of a stink at the time, was the Thalamus games, generally speaking, were great. They looked great, they played great, but there were some which weren't. There were some which you look back on in time and you play them today and you're like, dear God, how on earth did that get the score it got? Now, you know, it's kind of just business, isn't it? If you're paying a lot of money for ad revenue, that at that time you could take elsewhere, because there were quite a few gaming magazines out back then. It wasn't like there was a limit on what you could get in terms of magazines off the shelf. There were many magazines. If they elected to, you know, spend a considerable amount of money on ad revenue on your magazine, they're going to lean on you, because they want to sell games. That's their point of having those full-page ads. In some cases, there would be double-page ads. You know, that's putting a bit of money in the coffers of these magazines, and in return, you're wanting to get as much ad revenue. Sorry, you're wanting to get as many game sales as possible. Now, if your game is getting 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10, that's not happening. So you always used to see a lot of games would get 6 and 7 out of 10. That was like the safe score. And that was always the way it went. Always the way it went down. You know? And quite a lot of these games, well, they were decent, but, you know, when they're getting 8 and 9 out of 10 and you're like, nah, not a chance. Not a chance is that game worth that score. I'm just doing a bit of walking here, because I've got quite a bit to say, I think, still, on the subject. Yeah. There's no way that you're justifying some of these games getting the scores that they did, because I remember getting some of them and being like, it's all right, but it's not an 8 out of 10. It's not a 9 out of 10. That's for certain. You know, it's not a 7 out of 10. It's a 4 or 5 out of 10. It's average at best. And you see that today. I mean, people do talk about the IGN 7. You know, it's like the score they seem to give everything that's not actually very good. And again, it's because companies spend a lot of ad revenue with them, you know, and the trade-off for them companies is to sell the games. You know, that's what it's there for. That's what they're doing. And so I got really mad around the time of Gamergate. I got really mad with games journalists coming out and saying that they're not influenced, that their scores or their coverage is not influenced at all. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I mean, just common sense tells you it's going to be. If you're working for one of these websites and they're relying on ad revenue to fund them, I mean, just click on one of them with an ad blocker activated and watch how quickly they're asking you to deactivate it or pay a subscription. That never used to be the case. So then again, it indicates just how desperate they are and how reliant they are on ad revenue. And they expect you to believe that there's no correlation between that and the scores that they're going to give games. Nah, not having it. One of the things that I've said up quite a lot about this is these publications are supposed to be consumer facing. These magazines are for the consumer. They're not for game publishers to stroke their ego. They're not for games publishers to put their propaganda on why they've done something that is contemptible business-wise or anti-consumer. These magazines or these publications, these websites, this mainstream media, video game media, shouldn't be a mouthpiece for them. It shouldn't be part of the propaganda tool for them. They should be there And their sole reason should be to protect the consumer from this stuff. That's what they should be there to do, and they don't. And that to me is why the death knell was sounded for a lot of these publications as well, because they stopped looking after the interests of the people that were reading their websites. You know, when I think, was it 2013 or 2014, the infamous collective release of, Gamers Are Dead, which was simultaneously released across a number of websites at the time. Do you think that's a good idea when those gamers are the people that are putting eyes on your product, which in turn garners revenue? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I don't think that's clever. But that's what they do, and it dials into the thing I was saying about game publishers having an adversarial relationship with their customers. These websites did the same around that time. Why? Because they were being called out, because their credibility, their impartiality, their functionality to exist was being raised into question. If you're just a mouthpiece for game publishers and hardware manufacturers, if you're just a shill, what purpose do you serve? You essentially have no function. You do not need, here's the magpie. I'm sure that's the same one. I wish he had some distinctive markings, something I could see. But yeah, when you're doing that kind of thing, you can ask yourself the question, what do we do? What do we exist for? If you're no longer customer facing and you're not protecting the interest of the consumer, which is what you should be doing, then what function are you serving? Because these companies don't need you. They can do it themselves. And they've done it themselves down the years. They've got their own YouTube channels, they've got their own promotional ad revenue and spaces across all of social media. They do not need your website to promote themselves. You're convenient, but you're not needed. And that's the big problem with it. You're not needed. And then therefore, when the eyes started to drift away from those sites, when people started to go away and look at YouTube for a more honest and impartial view, supposedly, that's not always been the case, but supposedly, these websites suddenly cease to function. I use the phrase when I talk about game publishers, brain trusts, and that was the same with these websites. I will say that they're brain donors who are running it. Who do you think's going to look at your product? Who do you think puts you where you are? The consumer. Game publishers aren't going on your website every day for the latest news. They already know it. They're making the news. They've already done it. They've already made it. Hours, days, months, sometimes even years before they become available on their website. They're not going there for game reviews. So, your functionality was to look out for consumer interests, and you stopped doing that. And that's why you ended up in the bin. And that's consequently where it all ended up for these businesses, for these websites, these companies. And it's a shame, really, because, you know, a lot of people end up losing their jobs. A little bit of history goes by the by, again, as always, you know. And it's become quite tiresome. That's sort of how I think all of this has gone on, all of this has happened down the years. Why you've seen these websites disappearing, why game journalism has gone into the toilet. They essentially lost sight of what they were there to be, what they were there to do, which was to serve the consumer, not the corporations, not be a corporate shill. They're not going to bat. They didn't go to bat for consumers over DLC until it was too late. They didn't go to bat for consumers over, predatory price increases until it was too late. They defended it, and that was that. So I think I'll call it there. I might redo this at some point and do a better one, but yeah, that'll do. Catch you all later.